So welcome everyone, people who are here in person and everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you in person and online to our fourth event in the new hybrid speaker series at the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. This is our final event of the first year of our series, and it's going to take a slightly different form than our previous event. So rather than having a formal research talk, today's event is a conversation with a leading historian of the Caribbean and the African diaspora, my colleague and my friend, Dr. Michele Johnson. Matt Monrose, who you can see over to my left, is a PhD student in the history department here at McMaster. And Matt and I will talk to Michele about her research on Caribbean history, but also about her new co-edited collection, Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History. The book you can see right there. I think this is a wonderful note on which to follow up, on which to finish up a very successful first year of our speaker series. Before we start, I'd first like to thank Dr. Melike Yilmaz and Nadim Al-Nakal for helping organize the talk, and Catherine Lewis and Namdi Nake for helping with the introduction. And I also, of course, want to thank Matt and acknowledge his important contribution to this event. And finally, I also would like to thank the Office of the Vice President of Research for supporting this series through the Research Centers and Institutes Engagement Fund, and the African Black Diaspora Studies Program, which had made co-sponsoring this event. So thanks to everyone who's making this possible. So this speaker series allows us to hear from researchers working in various disciplines and on different geographies about diverse topics that align with the mandate of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. Just a few words about the center. So the center, CHRRJ, takes a broad approach to human rights and restorative justice. It approaches human rights not simply as legalistic entitlements, but also as ethical claims founded on cross-cultural notions of human dignity and well-being. Its approach to restorative justice emphasizes responsibility, redress, peacekeeping, and societal repair. The work of the center is founded on the belief that collective acknowledgement of past atrocities, redress of present abuses, reflection and repair through restorative justice processes can help build equitable and inclusive societies. Before I more formally introduce our guest, I'd like to take the time to offer the land acknowledgement to acknowledge the Indigenous inhabitants of the land that we are guests on and where we work, study, and live. So in writing this statement, I've drawn on language and ideas from the land acknowledgement statements of the City of Hamilton and McMaster University, as well as the websites of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nation. Acknowledging the original inhabitants of this land and the history they share with this land is an important step towards reconciliation. McMaster University Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice recognizes and acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaty and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It's also directly adjacent to the Haldeman Treaty territory. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. With this land acknowledgement, we acknowledge a debt to those who are here before us, and we recognize our responsibility and debt to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous people have to this land. So I'd now like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Michele Johnson. And we had a lovely conversation at lunch, and Michele, I was just reminding Michele how long we've known each other and how I've been following her work with great interest and enthusiasm for many years at this point. So Michele Johnson is Professor of History at York University. She's also the Associate Dean of Students in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York. She's the former director of York University's Harriet Tubman Institute for Research on Africa and its Diasporas, and she's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So Michele Johnson has contributed to an impressive number of thematic fields, including the history of gender and cultural practices, and the impact of colonialism, just to name a very few. But a dedication to telling the stories of African descended people, both in Canada and in the Caribbean, runs through all of her work. And so that's really one of the threads that connects her diverse scholarship. She's the author of numerous articles and chapters, and is a co-author with Brian Moore of two major and fascinating books on Caribbean history. I should have brought them to stand them up here, but I couldn't carry them in my bag today. Neither Led Nor Driven, Contesting British Cultural Imperialism in Jamaica, 1865 to 1920. That's a 2004 book. And They Do As They Please, The Jamaican Struggle for Cultural Freedom After Morant Bay from 2011. So these books really work together. They explore Jamaica's cultural landscape between the late 19th and the early 20th centuries and the various factors that shaped it. In these and other publications, Dr. Johnson has also explored gender, sex, and domestic life in the post-enslavement Caribbean, and she argues that uncovering these histories is crucial for our attempt to understand this period. More recently, in a 2022 book, which you can see in front of you, Dr. Johnson has co-edited a collection of essays on Black Canadian history with Fonke Aladejibi, Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian history, which includes chapters by some of the leading scholars in the field of Black Canadian history. This book won the Best Edited Collection Prize, awarded by the Canadian Studies Network. And this collection highlights the diverse experiences of people of African descent in the context of Canadian history. It situates Black Canadians as speakers and agents of their own lives, and it provides a nuanced examination of Black life in Canada. And so taken as a whole, Dr. Johnson's work has significantly advanced our understanding of Caribbean history and that of the wider African diaspora, and I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to talk to her about her work. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Michele. I mean, this is actually pretty great. So the way we're going to organize this is I'm going to start off with some questions about the Caribbean, which is my area of research. And then we'll switch gears and I'll turn things over to Matt, and he'll ask Michele about, or he'll have a conversation with Michele about Unsettling the Great White North and her work on Canadian history, Black Canadian history, which I see is such an interesting development in her scholarship. And it's so impressive the way that she's able to move from one region with its own complex, varied important history and to find connections with another part of the world. So, and so the first question I want to ask you about, and the questions I'm asking Michele come out of a lot of my own research interest. And so Michele, as I said, has worked on quite a number of fascinating thematic areas, but I'm really interested in your work on gender. And specifically, so you've done a lot of work on the subject of gender and women's lives and their experiences as working people whose labor has been historically undervalued and ignored. And so, for example, domestic work. And so I sort of have this question in my mind: why domestic labor? Why women's domestic work? And so I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that. So why domestic work? But how, because you've been working on this for a long time, so has your approach to this subject changed over time? And if so, how? And how do you see this? I mean, do you see women domestic workers as, are they victims? Were they supporting, did their labor support the status quo? Were they historical agents? I mean, how do you understand them and this kind of work? Okay, that's a very simple question. Very
simple, very short. Well, thank you so much, Juanita, for inviting me, and thanks to the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. Thank you to the Africa and Black Diaspora Studies for supporting this event. And while I'm now at McMaster looking at all of your wonderful buildings and wondering, I got lost this morning and Matt rescued me. So this is wonderful. So if I start off with why domestic service and what happened there and how it's come together with my career over time. But let me just pause and put a parenthesis here. when I'm hearing Juanita describe all this, I'm like, who is she talking about? It just sounded far more important than anything that I could imagine. But when I finished I did my undergraduate degree at University of the West Indies, Mona, which is only the best place ever. And after that, I got into the master's program and needed to do what would now be it was not a course-driven program, it was all thesis. So it was the MPhil.
Yeah.
And I went to my mentor, Barry Hickman.
Oh.
And some of you in this room might know Barry Hickman, one of the most important scholars of the Caribbean. And I said to him, Barry, I don't know what I'm doing. Could you help me? And he said, you know, Michelle, I've written this really small article about domestic servants a long time ago, but I've never picked it up. Nobody's done anything with it. Do you think that might interest you? And I went away and thought about it. And I thought, let me see what this is.
Yeah.
Now, just around this time, so to explain, for me, scholarship and life and everything else is all encompassing, it's all organic. I'm not very good at making strategic plans and then launching forth. So I had just had a daughter, and I was a grad student, and I was able to hire somebody from the country to come to stay with me and to help me. And at the same time, my mother had migrated to the States, and she had been a lifelong teacher. And she was working as a domestic servant in a home with a doctor in New Jersey. And I thought, this is too weird. So I brought it all together and thought, how can I, as a grad student, be hiring somebody? What does this mean? Because I had very little money. So how am I able to pay somebody? What am I actually? And so we started to talk in the house. Her name was Bubbles, just and so we would have these conversations about why she'd come into it. How was it that she had come from the country? Why was she staying with me? And those conversations became the jump off point. So yes, this is real. And once I started to do this work, I was still very social sciencey at the time. So lots of measurings and lots of censuses and lots of ministries, and so lots of numbers. So my MPhil at the time had 100 tables, 100 tables.
Okay.
Of this thing and that thing, and I am not a math person, so it was all very strange, but I did it because at the time it seemed like that was how you prove things, that was how they became real. You had to show by the number. Well, as late as the mid-20th century, almost half the women in the country were employed as domestic servants. How is that? How is that in such a small place, in such a poor place, so many people were able to employ domestic workers? And so it became a real thing for me. And then I started to interview the women who were doing this work, and it became real in a way that the numbers were helpful and grounding, but were never real. And some of the women I interviewed for that MPhil, I only did a few interviews, I started to ask around, like, how would I find them? And too many of them were to be found in what until recently was called the poor housing, coming out of the good old British poor laws. And so every parish has a poorhouse, and these women were congregating there because they had been in this employment, were paid so poorly. Their children hadn't been able to rescue them, and so they were there. And by the time I started to do the rounds to these houses, every time we did a series of interviews, I would go outside and weep because it was just so terrible what they had been through. And so they became my thing, and they remain in my heart, because these women have done the social reproduction in homes which have allowed the lower, the middle, the upper, the elite, because the range of of people who employ domestic labor across the Caribbean is quite wide. It's not an elite thing like here. It's, people can, and domestic workers can employ other domestic workers. It's that, the range is that wide. But it also means that the remuneration is that wide, the conditions of work are that wide. And I just wanted to capture this so that these tens of thousands of women who would leave no document for any archive, they would leave no memoir for anybody. Maybe if I could tell their stories, the importance of their lives in and of themselves would become noted.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating, Michelle. I wish, and I wasn't, I mean, I know some of the scholarship, I actually didn't know that Barry Hickman, who's this, or any of those Caribbean that's kind of out there in Zoomland, he's, one of our very important historians. And I'm fascinated that it was with Barry who helped us start to think about this subject. But your really wonderful description about the personal factors that drew you into this subject just reminds me of that whenever you ask a historian or any academic, explain to me why you're working on X or Y, at some level, there's always a personal story. There's always a personal connection. It always resonates with us in some kind of a way that allows us to work on a subject that's may be ignored or not for decades and keep us doing the hard work. Yeah. I think it's so interesting.
So how has the work changed? I'm trying to remember.
Oh, you said that wrong.
How has the work changed? So when it started off, it was really, as I mentioned, it's very social sciencey with lots of numbers and my source at the time was newspapers. Okay. So the newspapers I used in the classified ads to because that was the only place I could find the domestic worker. So the classified ads would say, wanted, young girl from the country to do babysitting, must be able to cook and clean, must live in, pay to be negotiated, come to this address. And I disaggregated those ads and found about 26 variables. And that was the basis of all these numbers. So I had these coaches, this is in the olden days, when we were filling in code sheets in green, those great big long code sheets. Oh and I go like, girl from the country, girl, one, that's the code, one, from the country, what, so I had all these variables, put it together and had all of these, these millions of tables that I barely could understand myself. Once I left that work, then I went to do my doctoral work. It stayed domestic service, but it became domestic service in imagery. So I looked at 10 sitcoms of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s on American television and their portrayal of domestic workers. So there were some who were Black, some who were white, some men, some women, some who were foreign, just a real mix, and tried to figure out the holy triad of race, class, and gender, and how those frame the portrayal of these workers. And that was that. And then I went back to the original study and did more interviews. So I now have 80 of these interviews that at some point will come to life. And then I came to Canada, right? And I tried to keep that project going. But very quickly, in teaching about Black Canadian history, the domestics, of course, left out again. And they were Caribbean domestics. I was like, here are my people, here are my peeps. And so I began that work. And so that is my research in the Canadian space, is the Caribbean women who migrated to Canada between 1900 and 1967, 68, and beyond, really 75, with a focus on various periods.
Wow. That's really, really interesting. And I think Matt is going to ask you some questions about your use of oral sources, which I'm going to be fascinated to hear about as well. We've had conversations in the past, and Michelle has actually helped guide me in my own thinking about how to use oral sources, and I've really learned so much from our conversations. But I'm interested in your use of newspapers. So that's obviously an important source for helping you work on domestics. And in the work that you co-edited with Brian Moore, and you obviously use newspapers, and you have two collections of primary sources, so as well as Kingston and The Land We Live In. And so most of that material is from the Gleaner newspaper. So for people who don't work on the Caribbean, who don't work on the history of Jamaica, I mean, that's an important newspaper. And it significantly has been digitalized from what, 1834 until now. Right, so its text is keyword searchable. So it is a very, very accessible newspaper source. But like, as I tell my students, all sources are problematic. So can you tell us a little bit about your relationship to the Gleaner and newspapers and how you use that material?
Okay, sure. So I use the newspaper in so many ways. In the first project, as I mentioned before, with the classified ads and the disaggregation, but also, so a bit about the Gleaner. Jamaica, from the maybe 17th century, 18th century, had newspapers that started, stopped. And some of them like Jamaica Times, Colonial Standard, and others are really important. But the Gleaner is our one newspaper that has lasted from 1834 until the present. And so there's a way in which its continuity helps to make it the newspaper of record. In Jamaica, for example, when you're going to buy a newspaper, people say you're going to buy the Gleaner, whether or not it's the Gleaner, right? Because there are other newspapers, but they call it so in the same way that other products have, where a brand will become the generic. So it is the newspaper of record, and over time, it has maintained a fairly conservative mind view. So the Gleaner is not often progressive. The Gleaner, sing it nicely. The Gleaner, in the years when Jamaica went through its socialist experiment, to call it that, the Gleaner was very critical and was behind the forces that wanted to end this experiment. So how to read the Gleaner? Always with the eye of who is writing this, who is the editor at the time, and what is the Gleaner's politics at the time. So that it is an important source because often it is the only source that will tell us about what is going on in the society. But because it presents very often, not always, but very often, the elite position, you get a sense of what is happening in the upper echelons of the society and what they are responding to. So the letters to the editor, for example, are often crucial because they will say, you know, they'll write to the editor and say, "Dear editor, I am so angry with all these dances in the night. They just make so much noise." And you're like, oh, something's going on here. And so the Gleaner will clue you in to what else is going on in the society. And then suddenly there's a law against noise. And then there are, you know, all these attempts to control and to clamp down on the people. But it is often the Gleaner that in there, whether the editorial or the articles or the letters to the editor will give you a sense of what is happening in the society, because that is where people come to argue in that newspaper.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I've used, as probably all Caribbean historians, anyone who's worked on Jamaica, we have all used the Gleaner, and I've made exhaustive use of it myself, and it's really interesting to hear your views about how you've been using it, and because you've been using it for so long, and obviously as your approach to history has changed over time, of course, as historians, and work always changes. And so that's really, that's actually really great. And in the two collections, these two primary source collections are wonderful, right? I mean, they're really rich. They're great sources for historians, but they're terrific for students as well.
Yeah. So those two resources we came across while doing the work for Neither Led Nor Driven, and they do as they keep those two books about the cultural history of Jamaica after the big uprising in Morant Bay, 1865. And what happened was that the Gleaner, for reasons that are not clear, decided to send people out, send two people out to do a kind of round the island, for the land we live in, round the island, report on what they were seeing in 1890. Fine. No idea. The leader just said, let's go out. And these two men went off and they would go to a village and say, they saw this, they went to Porus. And because the places are still there, and they took a picture of Porus, and there's a man with a donkey walking through Porus. Now, if you go to Porus today, it is still a town, but it's bustling and all this happening. And you're like, look at this place that became this place. So we became fascinated by the places that we were seeing in this report, and because they were still also there. The one for Kingston was again a report on the situation of the poor in Kingston. And it's called Squalid Kingston, and that was one of the titles of one of the articles, how the poor live and move and have their being. And it was just heartbreaking to hear the descriptions of poverty. Extreme. So this is inner city before inner city, right? This is Kingston, rough circumstances. But what was amazing was the places that they were describing were still there and still rough. So we're like, how can it be that almost 100 years later, there had been no significant improvements in these places in Kingston? And we thought, rather than just use it in the book, let's pull them out, pull together another little series that we found and say, make it available for everybody. So no, everybody doesn't have to go looking for what was Kingston like in around that.
And an incredibly rich resource, right? For academics, for students, for ordinary people who are just interested in the history of these places. That's really interesting. In the last question, well, actually, I have so many questions, and the last one I want to ask you before I sort of turn things over to Matt is, so, and probably, you have this impression now, which is accurate, that Michele has done quite a bit of work with other historians. And so these two books that we've just been talking about and these two primary source collections, she did them with a colleague of ours, Brian Moore, who also has done some really important work on the history of Guyana. But tell us about doing collaborative work. And I think that this is a question that I'm sort of personally interested in, but I think it's a question that is really useful the answer will be very useful for students and junior scholars. What is it like to do collaborative work? What are the pitfalls? What are the rewards?
So collaborative work is hard work, and it is very rewarding work. So let me do. When we were doing this work on the cultural history of Jamaica, we were able to cover so much material because we were working at the same project. So something that would have taken another scholar 5-6 years to go through, because we went through all the newspaper of the period, we were able to go to archives in Britain, in Scotland, in the States, all over. We were able to do, because we divided the work. Sure. And so Brian went to some archives, I went to other archives, and at the end we put it together. And remember, this is all pre-fancy digital whatever. Yeah. So we had our 3x5 cards, but we used paper because cards were too expensive. So we used paper, and we devised a scheme where we would put the general subject on one side, and then we sorted them, and we just worked together. When it came time to write, we were figuring out what to do now. Yeah. So we decided that we would divide the writing and then switch over and edit the writing, and then switch over and edit it again. And so before anybody saw it, we smoothed it out so that nobody could tell which chapter was written by which person. Every sentence in those two books were backwards. Yeah. So I would write, in my flowery language, what's this? And he'd say, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? And we would battle on every sentence because the tone, the material, the content, the analysis had to be in sync. And so we battled on everything before anybody saw it. So when the editors saw it, they were like, what? There's not even a comma missing. We're like, yeah, because every comma's been battled out already. And so that is the great benefit of collaborative work, depending on who you're working with. Right? Yeah. So if you find somebody with whom you have a very similar view, and Brian and I were very clear in our minds that what the Jamaican people were doing, they were constructing a culture in defiance of the British imperial culture, and they were saying, this is us. We'll take pieces of what we want from you, but this is ours, and we're going to make it ours. So the Jamaican culture you see today is built by people who have taken pieces from all over and said, this is us, we are very special. The Jamaicans believe we are very special. So that was our thing, and so we battled on everything. That is the upside. That is the up and downside. It can take longer to write because the negotiations are constant. But I believe the work is stronger because you have to justify, validate, make your argument to your colleague before it goes anywhere else. And if it is not strong, because you're both signing off on it, you will not sign off, Juanita, on something you don't agree with that I have written if we're writing it together. So you have to make your argument, you have to be sure, you have to do the work. So I liked it a lot, and I continue to like working with people, but I'm careful with the, who I'm going to work with. Is the other good side for me is that it gives me deadlines. Yes. So if Brian is expecting me to be finished with a chapter by such a date, I am going to find a way to do it. I find for myself, I very easily say, oh, well, I have this to read and that to read and this dissertation. And so I'll push back my own work, but if it's collaborative, it will get done. So it's interesting.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's actually really wonderful. And I can just say, I've read, both of the books that Michele and Brian Moore wrote together. When you read it, you can't tell. It's like, oh, this is Michelle's sentence. This is no. It reads like one person wrote it. And the way you describe the process sounds exhausting and time consuming, but totally effective. I have like a million more questions, but I'm going to stop myself and turn things over to Matt. And he will talk to you about this wonderful new book.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Dr. De Barros, for permitting me to ask some of my questions on the Canadian side. In line with working with other people, I'd encourage everyone to go out and procure a copy of Unsettling the Great White North, this edited collection with Dr. Funke Aladejebi, whom inspired this first question that I would like to ask you. Well, of course, a set of questions. I have them written down in case we need to go back. So in terms of methodology, what is the significance of oral history in your work? Generally, what are the advantages and limitations in terms of Canadian versus Caribbean history of oral methodologies? And then second, which is the question I want to ask you most, Funke Aladejebi has this poetic, beautiful sentence where she writes, oral history calls on scholars of Black Canada not only to listen critically to the narratives articulated by our participants, but also to interpret the silences, pauses, and nonverbal communication that participants demonstrate during the interview process. How does one interpret silences and pauses? Okay. That is my secondary question.
Okay, so just so that we're all clear, so Brian, just to go back to Brian for a minute. So Brian and I were colleagues at University of the West Indies. And Funky and I are colleagues, but Funky was actually my first grad student in Canada.
Okay.
Okay, and I say that to say, going back to the question of choice, right? Who can I work with? I knew by the time her dissertation was done that I could work with Funky because of the way that we had thought through her dissertation together. And it is in the dissertation that she started this oral history, these oral histories that come out in this and in her book. You know, we need for Matt to hold up Funky's book as well.
Yes.
Which is called Schooling the System. Or...
Yes, Schooling the System, part of the Wilson series as well.
Okay.
Yes.
So, so oral history to me is not just something that is done as a kind of add-on, as a, it would be nice to hear a voice. It is absolutely crucial, especially in communities of African descent, because those communities are often oral communities as opposed to writing communities. So if we privilege what is written, we miss too much. If there is an opportunity to hear from people what they have been through, what their histories have been like, how historical forces have impacted upon them, how they have negotiated, there is nothing that can rival hearing from somebody themselves, right? But what are the pitfalls? So we hear all these things about, oh, memory is not reliable. Is everything you read reliable? Is everything in the archives reliable? Some people are very deliberate in the construction of the archive because they know somebody will read it. So why do we privilege what has been written over what is spoken in terms of its veracity, right? So I start there. That said, memory does change. Memories, the thing we would remember, if we ask about something that happened in 1990, and we ask about it in 95, our memory of it is different from asking about it in 2005 because of what's happened in between. So we color our memories based on the life lived in between. So the longer we are from the moment, the more complex that memory becomes, or the decision not to remember, or the decision to remember differently. All of those are decisions which still don't invalidate memory. You have to be cognizant of why a person might misremember, why a person might choose to tell you only half the story. So we get to the silence. Okay, so when let me speak for when I do oral histories and I'm talking to the women. Okay, let me give you a good one. I did an interview with a woman who said that she was 14 when she started to work. And she said, I said, oh, how you remember you were 14? And she said, I remember the first job. I don't remember the others, but the first one. So you get a clue that often the first job is the one that sticks in the memory bank. So I said to her about the work and so on, and she talked about the relationship with the couple. The female employer was a dressmaker. The male employer seemed to be a businessman who was out a lot. And I asked her why she left the job. She said, oh, they weren't paying me right. And then she paused and said, yeah, they weren't paying me right. But the second time I knew there was something behind, they weren't paying me right. And so I said, oh, so I left it. And then I came back to it and said, you said they weren't paying you right. What happened? And she said, that wasn't the reason. Right? And she said, I left because the man came in on me one night. And I told him, if you don't get off of me, I'm going to kill you. And she said, I told the neighbor, and the neighbor noised it around the village. And the wife got angry at the young woman, at the employee. And she said to the woman, if you were a lady, you would have been in your bed at night. And I thought, well, where are we going? And suddenly the whole thing exploded because there was so much else that had been going on in the household.
Mhm.
But that first silence was the clue that if at all possible, you come back round to it. You can't do that with book, you can't do that with paper. You can probe in a way that you cannot do with the archives, right?
Mhm.
So I listen for, and when people laugh, and when I transcribe, I write in square brackets, laugh. I write in square brackets, shrug, or sigh, because it says something when somebody says, no, I don't really want to talk about that.
Yeah. And in this case, silences are indicative of larger echoes of more silence.
Very often, very often.
Segueing into the archive, you had mentioned the archives, and one of the contributors, Dr. Barrington Walker, who is here, McMaster.
It's Barrington. If anybody shows this to Barrington, tell him I don't appreciate his question in the book. Anyway.
First one over here. Yes, so there were numerous references throughout Unsettling the Great White North to expanding the meaning of the archives and methods of interrogation in relation to Black history in Canada. Barrington Walker asks, how are we going to go about the process of systematically remembering the Black past, and what is the nature of the archives from which we can draw? How can we define the Black Canadian archive, and what is our relationship to it? How might you answer?
That's good.
Yes.
So I don't think there's a single Black archive,
Okay.
right? I think there are multiple archives for multiple communities looking at multiple things.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's do a little bit of a deep dive. Okay. So in communities where there are records, it is important to preserve those records. In the Black community, there are many community organizations that have records that the persons who put them together have them, but nobody else has access to them.
Yeah.
And very often, as is, understandable, people don't think that these are archives. They think it's paper that they generated over time. So first, to convince people about the worth of what they've done, and that this ought to be preserved. It's still their choice, right? So there are some places in Ontario, the archives of Ontario they've rewritten their mandate, and their mandate now includes community archives. So if there's a way to begin to convince communities, to convince community organizations that the things that they have generated are worthwhile and should be preserved, that is one thing. The second important thing is the oral archive. We cannot rely on written paper. So in the Harriet Tubman Institute, for example, every year, my third year class, when I was teaching Black Canada, we would do oral histories. And we gathered those oral histories, and they're in an archive. But we need to have it robust, so that people can know where it is, contribute to it if they so desire. And even that archive has to be flexible. Some people don't mind being recorded. Some people don't mind video. Some people don't like video, right? So you have to be flexible in how it is recorded so that people's memories just don't go. And then maybe the third kind of archive is a material archive.
Yeah.
So, Caribana. There are costumes, there are the pan, there are things about Caribana, just as an important part of the Black community that we can preserve in a very deliberate way. I guess I would answer Barrington's question by saying that we have a responsibility, those of us who are in positions to make it so, have a responsibility to be deliberate about starting to gather these archives and to preserve them, because one of the reasons why Black experiences in Canada can be so easily put to the side is because there is no clear archive. There are archives in communities. There are, one or two funds here and there, but a significant Black archive. And it doesn't need to live in one place, but to be identified, the material, the oral, and the written.
Yeah,
all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, in my own research of finding there is, to your point, there is no one monolithic archive. There is just disparate and desperate searches of groping in the dark to find what you need.
Yeah, and it's a reminder, Matt, that there is no one Black community, right?
Yes.
Every time we talk about the Black community, we flatten people's lives into a oneness, a Blackness. And what is that Black community? The communities coming out of Africa. Come on. It's, I like to remind, it's not a country, it's a whole continent. With lots of people, lots of ethnicities, lots of worldviews and ways of remembering. And then Caribbean communities. Everybody is not from Jamaica. We would like it, but everybody is not from Jamaica. And then there's the Latin American community, the Afro-Latin American, the Afro-British community, and the long extant African community. Very, very complicated communities with relationships between and among them.
No, absolutely. Well, in interest of breaking that monolith, you have written on the notion of that Caribbean migrants who, despite their complexity, have come to represent a synecdoche for Blackness, along with some more recent continental African communities. So the question being, how do different ethnic groups within Canada's an inappropriately monolithic Black community articulate Blackness differently?
Okay, so it's not just Caribbean, as we know, it's Jamaican. Okay. So,
my apologies.
So if we're going to take the complexity of people's experiences seriously, then let us start within the Black community, right? Let us not flatten within the Black community and talk about the Black community, but our many, many communities, and to pay attention to the various ways in which people have come to be in this place called Canada, the various experiences that they've had here. There is no reason to think that the communities who have been here for 12 generations should have the same agenda as a community of people who have just arrived. Why? We don't expect all the people who are coming from Europe to have the same agenda. Oh, what is the European agenda? But somehow there's a Black agenda. And where is the unity? Well, where's the unity in Europe? We don't ask those questions, right? So we have to pay attention to the needs in each of these communities, while also paying attention to the things that unite these communities. Because whether you're from Kenya, from Somalia, from St. Lucia, or from Jamaica, there are some things that you share, such as harassment, such as the microaggression, such as the racism that comes out in various ways. But even that, how it is interpreted, there's no one way to interpret that. So we have to pay more attention and to push back against the larger society's tendency to flatten Blackness into oneness.
Well, thank you. Switching to more general, what inspired your scholarly expansion into Canada?
Well, I got a job. As I said before, I wish I could tell you that everything was strategic. Nah. To quote David Trotman, nah. No, I came to Canada, I came to York, and at the time, York, this is more than 20 years ago, York was at the forefront of expanding into Black Canada. Long before other people were doing it, York thought, well, let's do this.
Hmm.
So they put out this job for Black people in the Americas. So that is in fact the title. So I teach Caribbean, a little Latin America, not much, some US, Canada. And so, but Canada had its own course. It was a standalone. So I had to learn fast about Black Canada. Taught it for a couple of years, and we were all, at the time, those of us who were teaching at Barrington and others of us who were teaching it, were reliant on Robin Winks, the Blacks in Canada,
Yeah.
and just so unhappy, not with Winks' work, because it is really remarkable what he was able to do in archives, but his interpretations were hard. So every year the students would say, well, we have to read this terrible thing. And if you know anything about York students, is that they're not shy. And so they would make it clear that they didn't like the book. So we pivoted out of the book, out of Winks, into articles, right? Putting together course kits and trying to but it's never coherent. It's never a through line that's easy to draw. So Funke, who was my TA at the time, we said, what if we just asked everybody who is writing in the area to contribute something, we'd get something new. And we just kind of threw it out. We wrote to every person you can imagine.
Good.
Like 50 people or more. And some didn't respond, some responded and said they were too busy. And these people said, yeah, sure. And it just, yeah, so it took off there. So it grew out of a need in the classes
Okay.
that we identified over the years.
Pedagogical concern.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, towards Unsettling the Great White North, your scholarship in this lovely compendium, available at fine bookstores everywhere, is oriented towards unsettling nationalist narratives and myths pertaining to Canadian history and identity. Beyond unsettling and critiquing national Canadian myths, what for you was unsettling about the history you curated?
I think one of the things that all of us who know about Black Canada might be equally unsettled by this. It is the determination for national amnesia. There is a kind of way in which the Canadian scholarship, the Canadian nation has decided to forget. I am deciding to forget that Black people were enslaved for 200 years. I am deciding to forget that Black people contributed to the War of 1812. I am deciding to forget. So all of because the material is there. So the erasure, I had to come to the conclusion that it was deliberate.
Yeah.
So that was unsettling, because if you're in a nation where you're seen as an enemy, you're at least recognized. But if you are erased and forgotten, you have no language with which to engage with the larger monolith. So that was unsettling, the determination to forget. And what Cecil Foster famously calls the racism with a smile, that is unsettling.
Yeah.
Because the smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and it comes through in the scholarship as well, right? Oh, once a year, every February for 28 days or so, we'll pay attention, and then it's like, thank God, Black History Month is over. We can get back to normal. So there's a way in which cordoning off Blackness into this moment makes absolves the society of dealing with the fact that Black people are here, Black people have been here, and they will continue to be here. So don't do this thing, this Canadian thing of
pretending that it's not happening. I mean, I don't know. So that was unsettling to me, that there is no robust response to the questions that Black people have. There's no robust scholarly, political, provincial, federal response to the questions that we have about our place in this society.
Yes, when then that is like precipitated the rationale for writing this book and unsettling those who have unsettled you, I suppose. Do we have time for one more question, or is? Or...
No, actually, why don't we, I mean, because we can actually, because why don't we open it up to the people in the audience in person and the Zoom audience on chat, and then, but Matt and I, can also ask extra questions and certainly, because I think we both have a couple more things we'd like to talk about, but why don't we actually hear what others have to say? So I can, so Malake, I can kind of moderate the questions here, but if you and Zainab want to deal with the chat, so we can go kind of back and forth. Just to...
Currently, we don't have any question on the chat.
Okay, that's cool.
Please
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, for Tracy.
I'm really curious, when you were talking about the fact that the neighborhoods that were so rough at the turn of the century continue to be the neighborhoods that are rough today. Why is that? Is what causes that? The other day I was reading something and thinking about May Pen and looked it up and saw that it was actually a slave market and it continues to be called. You know, it's just the kinds of things that were coming at me, and I was struck that the neighborhoods were always the difficult neighborhoods.
No, that's a good question. That's a good question. So I think in a society such as Jamaica, where resources are limited, the possibility of addressing the systemic, deep reasons for underdevelopment and poverty are really challenging. For reasons that maybe our economists left, are reasons that might detain us in another place. I mean, the level of debt, of international debt, is incredibly high. Over time, these areas have gained, people have settled into these areas, and sometimes they've bought them and sometimes they've acquired them from the 19th century on through by just settling there. And they've gained reputations. Nobody, who's going to move them? Where would they put them? What kind of housing? And some of them are also invested in political parties who maintain a certain kind of relationship with them, right? So the answer to that one is big and complex. If people can, they do leave, but there is also a community there that looks after itself. In societies where the welfare state is either absent or not well developed, how to look after those who don't have, this is often the answer: to stay there, to be looked after by various means.
I guess geography too plays a role. Like, it's people who are, like, the wealthy are going up on the mountainsides, and
That's right.
people in poor communities are close to water where it can be flooded out. And
Yeah, and that's Kingston, Maypen, some parts of Montego Bay, primarily those concentrations. The rest of the island is, it's a mix more.
towards the airport too,
Yeah.
just beyond.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just,
And some of those historical reasons, I mean, so during the period of enslavement in the 19th century, I mean, those low-lying areas were seen as the unhealthy places. In fact, they were unhealthy. They were unhealthy places because there were mosquitoes and disease. And so people who had money and, people who were associated with the military and the official structures, they went higher up, right? Because those places were perceived as healthier, and in fact, they were.
Right. Yeah, it's not accidental, for example, that the British soldiers
went up to Newcastle.
Mm.
It takes about half a day to get down from Newcastle, whatever, while the black soldiers were put at upper camp, down on the plains where the mosquitoes were and so on.
And the heat.
So, yeah, you're right, yeah.
Yeah, and black soldiers were perceived erroneously as being immune,
Mhm.
in quotation marks,
Mhm.
to mosquito carrying diseases, right? Yeah, I mean, so there's all these historical elements and ideas about race and always, Juanita says, always underneath everything is always a medical and health.
No, and beneath that is the mosquito.
Yeah. Yeah.
Always-
Touche.
There's always the animal. My colleague Tracy works on animal studies. She always, so, but thanks Tracy for
I
that.
have another question,
Yeah.
but I can wait if there's other people who want to.
Yeah, I was
And
particularly
then-
interested in what you were saying about the erasure of Blacks in Canadian history. And, you know, as we know, the idea that this was, people fled to Canada, slaves fled to Canada. I mean, on the one hand, it's so important, but it's so central to denying or forgetting or not wanting to know that we had slavery here and not wanting to know about the racism here. And part of it is I study human rights activists in Ontario in the 1940s and 1950s, now I'm getting into the 60s. But one of their big tasks is to say, hey, this is Canada, but we do have racism, we have to deal with it. But I have a question about multiculturalism, because as you probably know, it's been criticized as, oh, well, we pay attention to people singing and dancing, but it doesn't do anything else. My question is, you know, what's the impact of multiculturalism on what you're saying about the erasure of Blacks in Canadian history?
Okay, so some of our colleagues call it the SARS and samosas moment.
exactly.
Where people are expected to come out and parade and do their costume and, oh, this is my food. You know, but is there really engagement with those communities? Not really. So from my point of view, what multiculturalism allows for is the continued segmentation of the society, perhaps even segregation of the society. And so, in a funny sort of way, when you go to Toronto and they say, oh, this is little this or little that, what does that mean? Does it mean that the people who come there just speak to each other and themselves, and then they don't really speak to so celebrating that without any attempt to understand what is going on inside of that, allows for people to remain, to not know who their neighbor might be. And not to, so multicultural has become shorthand for staying separate. For Black communities, however, it is very difficult because there is no, going back to Toronto as this year, there is no Black area unless you mean poor area, right? So that for many of the Black communities, their Blackness can be envisioned through their poverty and through their reliance on government housing, through the fact that they can't get jobs. Never mind that they might come here. We keep hearing, oh, Black immigrants are the most highly educated immigrants who come into Canada from the Caribbean and from Africa. So why are they packing boxes in Walmart? Right? So multiculturalism, like so much else in Canada, to me, allows for a veil of rhetoric. Oh, we're without really dealing with what is going on behind that veil. Everybody, when George Floyd was murdered and the world erupted, there were people in Canada who said, what does that have to do with us? Well, between 1970 and 2000-ish, 2020, more than 25 people were murdered by police just in Ontario. Never mind Quebec, never mind Nova Scotia, never mind. So how is that? How is it that Canada has come to script for itself an image of itself as being so tolerant
we're so tolerant. Well, not really. So it allows for the conversation not to happen. So I'd like to, talk to the folks about multiculturalism, what do you really mean? Because it was never meant beyond the French-British initial, 1971, Pierre Trudeau didn't mean South Asians. He did not mean that. He meant, oh, let's get this two solitudes there, multiculturalism, let's do that. And then all the other groups started to say, oh, me too, oh, me too. And so now it's just become rhetoric, but I don't know that there's real work being done to make it a true thing in Canada.
Thank you.
So I saw Daniel had a hand up and an alpha. I'm not okay. Is there anybody on the chat? So Daniel?
Or just to
Oh, yeah.
appreciate the work that the book is doing and that you have been doing in this regard. I was thinking about Adrian Shadd's book about Black history here in Hamilton.
Yeah.
And the meeting in 1823 of 200 Black parents in Ancaster to sign a petition because their kids weren't getting into school.
Yeah.
And who was the petition with was the police.
Yeah.
So this lack of a history of the role of the police in youth education. And then I also got thinking, how many people lived in Ancaster in total in 1823? 200 Black parents were meeting.
Yes.
What is the settler history of Ancaster, which, comes across to us as this kind of police village that was kind of closely associated with the, British side of the 1812 and these kinds of things, and the erasure, as you were saying about who was truly here, and then all you have to think is the Queen's Bush down the way.
Yeah.
And to your point about the erasure and the kind of attachment to the smile with no eyes and the smile, the history of how the Queen's Bush got emptied of Black settlers. These are the things that I wonder, can a book like this one then help everybody see, oh, there's Black history, we've been denying it all this time? Or are we gonna have, the Trumpian thing of, let's not teach Black history, let's not have critical race studies, will there be that kind of repression? What do you see happening in terms of reception of this kind of work and where it might go?
Okay, so what we're shorthand calling the Trumpian kind of response is far more widespread in Canada than we might be comfortable with admitting, right? We have seen the spike in racism over the last several years. It was always there. It just now has space and language to come out. I don't know that books like these will make any great difference. But what I do know is that on the heels of the terrible murder of George Floyd, many institutions finally said, oh, we need to do something about this. Oh, we need to hire some Black faculty. Never mind that Black people were always getting PhDs and in precarious work for their entire careers. Never mind that there were always we always had the ability to have minors and majors and whatnot, but nobody wanted to do that work because it's not important. The community is not important. It is the hope that now that almost everybody, we all have one, we have, Queens has, Dalhouse, so that with that kind of institutional buy-in, there is a little bit of a shift to the needle, but we have to watch that carefully. Because these pendulum, what's a plural pendulum? I don't know, those things swing back and forth. And we are already seeing the door closing. What we know in our Black communities is that it is only a matter of time before the door closes and we're back to the usual. So we have to push in this moment to get as much in as we can, because in another 5 years, it will have closed. And that will be, and so some other terrible thing will have to happen to open it again. That is what is unsettling. It is always something, and then the protest and the, Young Street, uprising, riot, uprising. It is in these moments where Black people are seen, often in violation. So Black people are seen in incarceration, in protest, always in these moments of negative engagement with the state. But going out, working hard every day, no, not seen, not contributing, just a problem.
Thank you for the question, Daniel and Tracy and Ruth. Alpha,
That's, well, first of all, books like this do matter. It's why we're here having this conversation, and I think they are really just an important part of all of the work that we're doing and the space that we are seeing opening up. So I appreciate this work very much. I have, of course, also lots of questions, but been restraining myself. I think the first thing I'm personally very intrigued about in my own work is part of what you alluded to in terms of breaking the monolith and looking at the different articulations of Blackness across Canada, across time and geography. I also, speaking of Jamaican superiority, I find it really interesting how it's connected to what you were talking about earlier as far as the erasure of Black history in Canada, and about how little we know about historical Black experiences. And so for so many people, especially in the kind of metropoles, Blackness in Canada has a sort of a Jamaican-ness to it, right? And the sort of how it's synonymous with particular urban expressions of Blackness and very kind of, again, Jamaican. I think specifically of someone like, I hate to invoke Drake, but to invoke Drake, this Black Canadian figure who, in one song is, singing in patois, and then also just got a Miskeen tattoo on his face, which is like a nod to his, it's an Arabic word, but a nod to his, some might say, appropriation of Somali kind of Canadian like cultural experiences. I think we're in this really interesting place, and one that I'm really curious about. But connected to that, I'm really interested in what you see as far as the development. This is building off Daniel's question, this development of Black studies in Canada, and I think we are in an interesting moment connected to, of course, the murder of George Floyd and a number of other things. And what are your observations / predictions about how Black studies in Canada is or should develop in comparison to Black studies in the US? Because so much of the way that when we do talk about Blackness in Canada, it has often been, has leaned very heavily upon Black American experiences, histories, and Black American studies. But we have a very unique history and set of experiences historically and contemporarily. So I'm just curious about sort of how you've been thinking through this and what you see like developing that's similar or different.
So many of the Black Studies programs in the States really suffer from being ghettoized, right? So the institutions create them, the faculty are hired into them, and then they're put off to the side, unless they are in the historically Black universities and colleges where that doesn't happen. I think it is important, as McMaster and Queens and York, and we all think these things through, that we're careful about our many communities, so that we're not repeating the master narrative of one Blackness, of opening space for our many voices and our many communities. I think it's important that even if the programs have some history, a lot of cultural studies, because that is often where the dynamic work is going on, some gender, so that it becomes a holistic representation of Black people's lives. And I think it is important to keep those political, that political avenue open if there is any hint of being pushed off to the side, that the communities rally and say, no, 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 we're not having this. Already we're seeing the excitement about hiring has become quite muted. So already we're seeing that the, young Black scholars who are getting their doctoral work done and so on, where are they going to be hired? Where are they going to be hired? So institutions need to go beyond the George Floyd moment and to make true commitments, financial resource commitments to Black studies wherever these institutions are. Don't ride on the back of George Floyd to do the politics for a moment, to quiet the voices so that we will go back into silence.
That's wonderful. I mean, that's great. I have so many, but I want to hear more from the audience. So more questions from, yeah, please.
You mentioned earlier racism with a smile, and that's something I've talked about with my dad a lot. And he's lived in the States, and he's mentioned that racism in the States kind of has a very different face, and that it's very blatant and in your face kind of thing. And then you also mentioned but I'm not sure what it means.
Oh,
Ruth mentioned about the slaves fleeing to Canada as well. So I was wondering if racism with a smile in Canada, is that sort of a consequence of slaves fleeing to Canada, or is it kind of on the path of like deconstructing racism? Lack of a better term.
So I'm just going to go wild into my theories now. Like, where's the scholarship? I don't know. So because the institution of slavery was so large, so robust in the United States, their version, in parts of the United States, their version of racism took a particular track. And their version of white supremacy took a particular track. In the case of Canada, the way that people often define themselves is we're not American. Right? We are not American, therefore we don't. We're not American, therefore we don't. And so I think some of that smiling comes from the determination not to be as blatant as the American. Not that the feelings are any different. It's just that the masking is more masterful. It's very British in that kind of, so it's culturally constructed. There's nothing intrinsic or normal about it. It's a cultural response to the reality of difference and sharing that border with a country about whom there is so much unease. Still, as I said before, the number of people who feel exactly as the Americans and are no longer feeling they have to hide it is growing. Right? So the smile is not so smiley anymore. Yeah.
Okay, are there any questions? Okay. So are there other questions from
Just a footnote to say, I think that the British emergence of Canada had this built-in idea of the civil, that is the smile. Civility was a big deal for emerging Canadians to distinguish themselves from this violent place that had civil wars and stuff over the slave trade and things. And so the Canadian need to distinguish itself had this strong sense of a kind of gentlemanly Britishness that was racist, but at the core of it, even it had this civil smile. And so that civility remains, and yet, as you're pointing out, this is a time where this veneer of the civil is getting thinner and thinner, and maybe it's with Freedom Convoy and things, maybe it doesn't exist anymore, I don't know.
And there are people who have lived in both societies who will tell you they prefer the in-your-face version, because at least they know then what they're dealing with. You don't like me, I don't like you, that's fine. But when you get the smile and you're not sure did I just experience racism? Is that person following me around the store? Because, so that the experience becomes much more atomized. People feel like I am experiencing it, it must be me, as opposed to it's a systemic thing, we need to address it.
Social gaslighting.
Yeah. Okay, I think this has been a long and fascinating conversation, and you have told us so much and shared so many of your views about history and writing and research and the world that we're living in and the academy. And I just want to say thank you. I mean, this has been just a wonderful conversation. I knew it would be. And it's just been so fast. Like are you kidding, man? I could talk for hours, man. But you've been talking a lot and you must be kind of tired. But and thanks everyone who showed up, who came in person, and people who showed up online. I think this is just, as I said at the beginning, just a wonderful way to end a really successful first year of our speaker series. And I'm so glad that we have the support of African and Black Studies here at MAC. And I look forward to more wonderful conversations and research talks next year. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Michelle. This is
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks everyone.